Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Berkeley, who will be giving the welcome address, has launched a poll, so feel free to fill it out. We will start in about 2 minutes, letting people continue to trickle in. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the seventh annual Racism in Medicine Conference, hosted by Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. My name is Chidinma Osuagwu, and I am one of the many committee members who helped bring this conference together. We are so grateful to have you join us today for an illuminating discourse and conversation on many elements of equity and combating anti-racism in the medical field. Our hope is that by the end of the conference, you've picked up tools to better equip yourself as an advocate for patients and the community to which we serve. I am honored today to introduce our welcome address speaker, Dr. Berkeley, who is our Interim Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as the Clinical Anesthesiology Residency Director at Temple. Dr. Berkeley attended the University of California, San Francisco for medical school. She completed her residency in anesthesiology and a fellowship in pain medicine at Cornell in New York. At Temple University Hospital, Dr. Berkeley has worked primarily in the fields of pain medicine and obstetric anesthesia before becoming program director. She has authored several presentations for the American Society of Anesthesiologists annual conference. Prior to entering the field, Dr. Berkeley completed her JD at the University of Pennsylvania. She practiced litigation as well as labor and employment law at two top Philadelphia law firms for several years before deciding to pursue a degree in medicine. She has written several articles on employment law. She is always looking for avenues to combine her interests in law and medicine. Her work at UCSF on conflict of interest policies is a seminal article which has redefined the world of research. Dr. Berkeley, thank you again for joining us today. Feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful introduction, probably better than I deserve. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. Thanks to the organizers for creating what is going to be a phenomenal conference. I'm really impressed. And thank you for those of you who have joined to be a part of this. I would like to begin by sharing my screen. I will confess that I am not the best. I'm often challenged when it comes to, um, is it flashing for everyone? Okay, there. Um, uh, so I might need some help. I've uploaded this document as well in the chat at some point at some place. So if you're unable to see my screen, feel free to look at the documents that have been added. The world as it is today is essentially a lot more integrated for all of us than it used to be. And the topic of diversity is one that matters to many of us on a personal level. And as I go through all of this information, I challenge us to think about who we are and to admit and be willing to examine that none of us maybe is as good as we would like to be or as altruistic as we think we are. And essentially, that for most of us to be truly engaged on any topic of import, the argument has to be one that has to be much greater than what is the right thing that should be done. At the end of today, if we are to be motivated to create a diverse workplace, there has to be an economic or other more tangible gain, and that gain must outweigh the associated risks or losses. Over the next few minutes, I want us to review the changing demographics within the nation, examine the factors that have motivated US businesses to invest in diversity, investigate some of the strategies that have been used in business and in other arenas to promote diversity within their ranks, and discuss some of the legal challenges that are facing employers related to to creating diversity within the workplace. Some of those challenges have recently actually impacted the healthcare field, so I think they'll be interesting to look at. But before we do, I'd like to make the following disclosures. I'm a first generation American who grew up in the Caribbean. This is my immediate family, and I have no financial disclosures to make. The demographics within the US are known to have been changing. And between 2014 and 2060, the US population is projected to increase by approximately 100 million people. One-fifth of that population growth is anticipated to be foreign born. The non-Hispanic white population is currently the majority group within this country, with greater than 50% of the nation's population. By 2060, this group, the non-Hispanic white population, is projected to be 44% of the US population. When this happens, we will become a majority minority nation. According to current US Census projections, the majority minority crossover will actually occur in 2044. In 2014, there were more than 20 million kids under 5 years of age living in the US, and 50.2% of them were minorities. The minority majority trend reflected amongst these now 13-year-olds within our country, within the current day, is literally the beginning of the shifting demographics of our nation. Diversity matters to us on a personal level because if it hasn't impacted you yet, the 13-year-old kids in this country or eighth graders are the first evidence of this future. On a related footnote, the US ranks 20th out of 28 industrialized countries in high school graduation rates. The COVID pandemic, which has put a wrench into many estimates, has been estimated that by 2020, three-quarters of all American jobs will require high skill levels and will need 123 million people to fill them. At the current high school graduation rate, only 50 million Americans will qualify. This means that we will be looking for foreign-born folks to essentially come into the US to meet some of the needs within our healthcare system and within the job population throughout. On a global level, big businesses honed into diversity in a way that maybe healthcare and some other industries hasn't been thus far. Companies try to have a workforce that reflects the regions that they're working in. Investors and clients want to see themselves reflected in the company's junior and senior workforces, and local hires also help to navigate cultural and language barriers. This is something that's happening a little bit more in healthcare, and people at Johns Hopkins, for instance, have been looking at really harnessing some of the local talent within their area to fill some of the voids within employment opportunities there. Diverse teams and companies essentially make better decisions, and companies that have at least $5 billion in revenue have been putting significantly more focus on retention and recruitment strategies within their diversity inclusion programs than are their smaller counterparts. And that's been happening for about the last 8 to 10 years. Since the 1970s, organizational demographers have argued that the greater the minorities' representation within any organization, the more likely the majority is to perceive them realistically and to interact with them without focusing on group differences. That is to say, that having a small group of a minority population is not really helpful to the vitality and the vibrancy within any company. Some, however, argue that categories like race and gender can be so divisive that they actually overwhelm the structural effect of a relative group size. There is, however, decades of work demonstrating that diverse groups, groups with variety in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, are actually more innovative than homogenous groups. I want us to take a little bit of look into some of those research areas. So there is some research on gender. Two business professors from the University of Maryland and Columbia University studied the effects of gender diversity on top firms in Standard & Poor's Composite 1500 list. This list is designed to reflect the overall US equity market. They examined the size and gender compositions of the firm's top management teams from 1992 to 2006, and they looked at the financial performance of those firms. On average, they found that female representation in top management led to an increase of $42 million in firm value. They also measured the firm's innovation intensity, the ratio of research and development expenses to assets. They found that companies that prioritized innovation actually saw greater financial gains when women were part of the top leadership ranks. In a study conducted in 2003, a professor of management at the University of Texas in Dallas and his colleagues surveyed executives at 177 national banks in the US. They then put together a database comparing the financial performance, racial diversity, and the emphasis that the bank presidents put on innovation. For innovation-focused banks, increases in racial diversity were clearly related to enhanced financial performance. Research from the McKinsey and Company Group also demonstrates a statistically significant relationship between a more diverse leadership team and better financial performance. In a report published in 2015 reviewing data from hundreds of organizations in the UK, the US, Latin America, and Canada, they found that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have financial returns above their national industry median than those in the top quartile for racial ethnic diversity. Those groups were 35% more likely to have greater financial returns than their national industry mean. So focusing on diversity within big business has really panned out in terms of financial gains. And that's something that is really important for us as a healthcare industry to start focusing on as well. A lot of people will not just buy that it is the right thing to do, but essentially it is also the thing that makes the most financial sense, and that will matter to some people more than the other argument ever will. In 2004, A professor at Stanford Graduate School of Education collaborated with 5 colleagues from a few institutions to look at the influence of racial composition in some small group discussions. They gathered over 350 students from 3 universities, and they created small groups to discuss a prevailing social issue. Now, the social issue might have been like child labor laws or the death penalty, and this group would have met for about 15 minutes. The researchers wrote dissenting opinions and had both Black and white members deliver them to their respective groups. They found that when a Black person presented a dissenting perspective to a group of whites, the perspective was viewed as novel and led to broader thinking and consideration of alternatives than when a white person introduced that same dissenting perspective. When we gather information from someone who is different from us, we actually receive that information differently and we think about it more deeply than we would if it's being offered from someone who is considered on facial appearances to be similar to us. 3 professors of management at the University of Illinois, Oklahoma State University, and Ohio State University asked 183 people whether they identified as Democrat or Republican. The participants then had to read a murder mystery and decide who they thought committed the crime. The subjects were then asked to prepare for a meeting with another group member by writing an essay communicating their perspective. They were told that their partner disagreed with their opinion, but that they would need to come up with an agreement with the other person. Half of the participants were told that their partner was a member of the opposing political party, and half were told that their partner was a member of their same party. The result was that people making arguments before a partner with the same political affiliation showed up less prepared. When disagreement comes from a socially different person, we are prompted to work harder. Diversity essentially jolts us into cognitive action in ways that homogeneity simply does not. Diversity becomes a powerful motivating factor for us. In a 2006 study, a study of jury decision making was undertaken. A social psychologist from Tufts University, in collaboration with judges and jury administrators in Michigan, conducted I went ahead a little faster, conducted mock jury trials with a group of jurors. The Summers composed the 6-person juries with either all white jurors or 4 white and 2 Black jurors. The diverse juries were better at considering case facts. They made fewer errors recalling relevant information, and they displayed greater openness to discussing the role of race in the case at hand. In 2014, a study was also conducted on the effects of supervisor demographics of race, gender, age, and cohort, and any relational differences in these within the supervisor-subordinate relationship on job employee satisfaction for millennial employees. A sample of about 1,000 millennials from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth database was compiled. They found the supervisors' demographics and the relational differences in these significantly affected millennials' job satisfaction. They found, unfortunately, that having a white older supervisor positively affects job satisfaction. They did find that there was no preference to whether that person was male or female. And this may actually be evidence of the trending increase in female supervisors, particularly in the management at entry-level positions. But it does let us know that millennials and others that are in a younger population are certainly no different than some of their older generation peers when it comes to information about peers. about supervisors. In terms of recruitment and retention strategies that I've employed within the business world, there are some that have been incredibly successful and some that have failed. I think many of us are aware of the blind auditions, and in the 70s, like about 10% of all orchestra conductors were female. Then in the 70s and the 80s, most symphony orchestras in the US started to adopt blind auditions to conceal the identity of potential candidates from the jury by a screen. By the mid 90s, there was a 35% increase in female hires. The transition to blind auditions over the 20-year period can explain that 30% increase in the proportion of females among new hires, and possibly the 25% increase in the percentage of females within orchestras. Uh, in US companies with more than 100 employees, the proportion of Black men in management has increased incredibly slightly, 3% to 3.3%, so almost no different from 1985 to 2014. White women went up from 20% to 29% within the same time frame, but hasn't moved since. These are companies, many of which have diversity programs. So why is there no difference? Why is there no improvement in terms of the increase in terms of Black men in management as well as white women? In the early 90s and 2000, Morgan Stanley shelled out about $54 million, and Barney Smith and Merrill Lynch more than $100 million in sex discrimination cases. In 27, a new class action, which cost the company $46 million, was on the table. In 2013, Bank of America and Merrill Lynch settled a race discrimination case to the tune of $160 million. Merrill Lynch's 15-year payout in discrimination cases was $500 million. If we assume that bias can be subtle and ingrained, how can we isolate the failing steps within attempts to recruit and retain people who are within the underrepresented minority population? There are many strategies that are out there for diversity recruitment. Some of them have failed, and some of them are things that people try repeatedly. Diversity training, for instance, people seem to rebel against structures that they see as curbing their independence or accusing them of racism. Diversity training typically at most companies will last on the order of 1 to 2 days, and many studies indicate that it actually causes a backlash and can actually activate bias. Diversity training and other similar techniques are viewed as a threat from the employer and the protected group, and that is part of why they don't really seem to succeed within the business world. With their hiring test as well. 40% of companies have mandatory hiring tests to assess worker skills. Most companies only seem to pay attention to the test and the results, however, when they're screening women and minorities. The results of white males were ignored even if they were tested. About 10% of the companies that had these tests generally see a decline in the share of managerial jobs for white women and minorities by 4 to 10% over over a 5-year period, primarily again because they're only focusing on the results of those tests for those populations and not within the white male group. Performance ratings is another diversity strategy that has failed. 90% of mid-sized and large companies use annual performance rates to ensure fair pay and promotion. But generally, raters tend to lowball women and minorities in performance reviews. And then there are some managers who, for whatever reason, just give everyone high marks. Grievance systems is another arena in which companies have failed in terms of improving diversity. There tends to be a decrease in the managerial ranks of white women and minorities from anywhere from 3 to 11% within 5 years of establishing grievance systems. Generally, managers are found to ridicule employees who complain, and employees in turn will file fewer grievances. So what are the strategies that we find actually improve recruitment and retention within big business that we can then leverage within the healthcare system? We spoke a little bit about blind auditions and what has happened in the business and music industries. And now within a lot of residency programs, and certainly within the ACGME, there is a prompt to blind applications coming in from residents. Some of that right now is blinded in terms of the facial features of a person, but for many of us, our names will give us away. So even if your face is blinded, the bias still exists within the name recognition or name association within certain groups. So pretending to be blinded but not being fully blinded may actually be harming efforts at recruiting diverse populations. Uh, in terms of other things that are happening within the big business, Douchebank's Global Health of Diversity essentially says, and I think this holds true for many of us, if you want to attract the best talent, you have to be reflective of that talent. People are not going to come to your business, they're not going to come to your hospital unless you already have a visible support for them that is there and present. 65% of companies surveyed by Forbes with revenues over 500 billion have programs in place to recruit underrepresented minorities. 53% of them have diversity-focused development programs, and 44% have specific diversity retention programs. In generally, strategies that seem to work either create buy-in from the employees and managers, or they promote transparencies. So managers that go to college recruitment fairs, they feel obligated to come back with good applicants. These programs actually show an increase in minority candidates by about 10%. And if you look at what's happening in a lot of the healthcare systems, people are creating spaces for underrepresented minorities to either do rotations at their institution or sending people to groups like the SNMA conference, which is imminent in the next week, to actually do a lot of recruitment. Mentoring is also effective. Mentors become very willing to have their charges get a break and guide them. White males find mentors on their own, but women and minorities tend to need more formal programs. Some research on mentoring also indicates that white men, and if we're using them primarily because they would primarily be the people that we would think of as having decision making power. White men do not necessarily feel comfortable approaching women or minorities or on their own. However, white males are eager to help women and minorities they are assigned to, and women and minorities are often the first to sign up for mentors if you have a system like that in place. Mentoring programs boost representation by 9 to 24%. And that goes along with the recruitment fairs if you think about it. Because you have somebody who's eager to see their mentee win, you are more likely to have success in retaining and recruiting underrepresented minorities if you have an established mentorship program. Institutional diversity exposure is also important. This story is a little off kilter, but it goes to show some of the inherent benefits from it. So in World War II, blacks and whites were segregated and fighting until really high casualties forced desegregation in some of the groups. The groups that were desegregated came to see each other as soldiers first and foremost, and as equals in the war effort. In firms that create self-managed work teams or rotate management trainees to increase contact between women and minority groups with the majority population, you actually see a rise and improvement in terms of benefits for the company. Cross-training also deepens the employee's understanding of the organization as a whole. So the goal of diversity, the goal of recruitment, the goal of retention, the goal of working as a team actually harnesses and improves the ability to benefit women and minorities. 1/3 of US firms have self-managed teams for core operations, and 4/5 of them are using cross-training. I'm going to skip this slide, I think. Um, Employers essentially need to see that efforts of diversity are productive. Efficacy is tracked using employee reviews, feedback on company policies, attrition rates, and some use programs that tie their manager's performance to development goals. You have to be able to measure the impact of your diversity and inclusion efforts in order to be a sell and in order to be a win wherever you're located, whether it's within healthcare, whether it's within big business. Policies and programs typically historically have been implemented through HR or human resources, and the most popular measure of metrics is productivity. So how well people are actually performing now that you've brought them in, or how well the company is performing. Those are key metrics that everyone will be looking at to measure the benefit of a diverse workforce. Employee morale also matters. Employee turnover is also something that is measured a lot. Accountability is maintained either by performance reviews, people might give bonuses, salary increases, uh, business department reviews, and promotions. These are all benefits that go towards rewarding people for diversity programs and really having things move forward in a positive direction. Uh, I think most of us probably recognize that the world of diversity is filled with a number of legal issues, and if you aren't, certainly within the current year or so, we have several legal cases that are out there for people to think about when they think of diversity. So the issues begin like, can you actually pursue a goal of diversity within the bounds of our legal system? And for decades, that has been challenged in one form or the other. And does diversity ultimately mean discrimination against white males? And that, again, is something that has been coming up for many generations, and over the past year or two has changed to include some other populations who are concerned that the pursuit of diversity means discrimination against them. So let's take a little look at the case law. Um, Attorneys and lawmakers, I think you'll find around the country, tend to be deliberate and cautious when they define legal elements. They understand and they're acutely aware that the circumstances that they can't envision might arise and demand a flexibility that they aren't currently able to conceive of. The law is not applied in the sterility of a conference room, but essentially like people like us who have biases and who have heart, and to the individual sitting before them, not to unknown masses. So I'm going to share a few cases that had come up in the past where there were awards made for people who had experienced discrimination or had alleged discrimination, just so people have a glance that it is not just Black versus white. So in June of 2015, the EEOC filed an amicus brief, and I know I'm probably being too legal, in support of a Caucasian woman whose discrimination case had been dismissed for failure to essentially establish a proper case. The plaintiff's supervisors had made comments to her. You are the wrong color. You are too old. One supervisor had called her an old white, and I won't fill in the blank, shortly before they terminated her. So some of this diversity case law and some of the fights within discrimination are not just, again, as I said, applied within the for underrepresented minorities solely, but they actually cross what might be considered a racial divide. In September of 2012, a county in Hawaii paid uh, $120,000 to settle a racial harassment claim by a Caucasian attorney whose manager allegedly made disparaging comments to her that she needed to assimilate more into the local culture and break up with her Caucasian boyfriend in favor of a local boy. In 2014, a Caucasian teacher won a reverse discrimination case stemming from his termination, notwithstanding being named Teacher of the Year and receiving multiple perfect job performance evaluations. The gym teacher who had become the principal had essentially told students that the only reason a white man teaches in Prince George's County is that they can't get a job elsewhere. She later referred to the plaintiff in a few disparaging remarks as well. These cases, however we want to view them, are pure and simple race, gender, age discrimination case. There is nothing reversed about them. So the law fits for everyone. Ultimately, everyone wants to be treated fairly, and the courts and the legislatures agree. One of the more prominent cases of reverse discrimination uh, reached the Supreme Court in the 1970s when a student with good grades named Alan Bakke accused the University of California in Davis of twice denying him admission because he was white. The University of California at the time had 16 out of 100 slots that they specifically reserved for qualified minorities as part of the university's affirmative action program. The Bakke case essentially established that a quota system, which allows one group to apply for 84 slots and another for 100 slots, violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But the decision was more than that. In Gutter versus Bollinger, which is also here, the court in 2003 reaffirmed that the use of quotas is unacceptable. It went on to state that not every decision influenced by race and presumably age and gender is objectionable, stating that the use of race as criteria in creating a diverse pool of applicants was permissible. The court also noted that the admissions criteria for the law school allowed the acceptance of non-minorities with lower scores than those of minority applicants. The law school's use of soft criteria of recommendations and quality of essays and quality of undergraduate school was upheld. The Guttner Court recognized the goal of diversity as laudable and noted that American businesses were beginning to note the importance of diversity and exposure to diversity as a real benefit in an increasingly global marketplace. Race brings to the table something different, much as rural upbringing or regional diversity would as well. Most recently, in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court recently upheld summary judgment in favor of the University of Texas in this case filed by Fisher. Under Texas law, the top 10% of any Texas high school was offered admissions to the University of Texas. The remaining applicants, about a quarter of them, were accepted based on a combination of academic index, which comprised their SAT score as well as high school performance. And in the wake of Guttner, their personal achievement index, which sought in part to improve diversity of all sorts and considered race as one of many criteria within their definition of diversity, was upheld as something that was positive and good. So the lessons to be gleaned from Bakke and its legacy, lessons that we within the college arena or any other educational system have to pay attention to, is you have to establish minimum criteria for success. You have to stick to whatever that criteria is that you have defined. Beyond that, you're not prohibited from looking at the diversity of experiences that your applicants bring to a table, or even excluding potential applicants based on personality conflicts. If you set goals such as helping economically or educationally disadvantaged persons, you have to be clear about the rationale, and you have to set appropriate criteria for accomplishing that goal. If you truly set criteria for ascertaining that goal, you will be unable to exclude based on race, gender, and age. You also need to keep your hiring process clean. In the background of the Baki case, some authors noted that the committee chairman had created special slots for political reasons, and that one Caucasian medical student who had been accepted in the time that Baki had also been rejected, that Caucasian medical student got in without even submitting an application. It had been a political favor to his father. So the history of Baki and Baki's view as being anti-affirmative action, anti-quota systems is actually more than that. The entire system, the entire structure that had been created around Baki was actually so problematic, where people were getting in without even submitting an application, that it may have simply been the structure that caused the decision that came down. If your hiring process is complicated, if your hiring process is corrupt, you not only become suspect in all you do, but you tie your lawyer's hands in terms of dealing in a forthright issue with all manners of issues that arise. So in closing, there are a couple of cases or a couple of events that I kind of want to bring up and highlight for people. Um, in October of 2016, some of you will remember Yahoo CEO Marissa Mayer and their former CMO and editor of chief, all of whom were female, were accused of engaging in gender discrimination. In a lawsuit that had been filed by the former Yahoo editorial director, it had been alleged that Mayer encouraged and fostered the use of of uh, of to accommodate management's subjective biases to the detriment of Yahoo's male employees. And many of the men had filed lawsuits saying that they had been discriminated against for being male. Although in many companies, the mirror image was actually the norm. And I leave you with the thoughts of the current lawsuit against Novant Health, which awarded a $10 million verdict in favor of a white male plaintiff who found that he had been terminated by the healthcare system in their efforts to increase diversity. So that is the world in which we are working in right now. And I leave you with the polls. How many of us are willing to step aside to create a diverse workplace? Thanks a lot for the time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berkeley, and thank you everyone who has trickled in and has joined the conference. You may now join the different panels. We have 2 panels that are going on at 10 a.m. We did have a raffle planned for this time, but we went a little bit over. However, there are going to be raffles throughout the entire day, and they're going to increase in value, and you'll hear more about that from our experienced director, Amaka, after the first panel. So feel free to join. Let us know, send us an email or a message if you're having any technical difficulties, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.